I turned 92 this winter. At my age, the house is quieter than it used to be. The clock on the wall ticks louder than any voice that once filled these rooms. Sometimes I sit by the window for hours, watching the street like it might bring something back to me. But of course it never does. My husband Arthur died 8 months ago. 47 years we were married, 47 birthdays, 47 Christmas mornings, 47 summers where he insisted on planting tomatoes in a garden that never grew quite the way he hoped. People who came to the funeral said the same thing over and over, "What a beautiful marriage you two had," and I would smile, I would nod, I would hold their hands and thank them. But inside, I felt something twisting in my chest, because the truth is, Arthur died without ever knowing something about me, something I should have told him decades ago, something I tried to tell him 100 different times. But every time the words reached my throat, fear pushed them back down. You see, when you live long enough with someone, you build a life that feels like glass. And sometimes the truth can shatter it, so you keep quiet. You tell yourself it's too late. You tell yourself the past doesn't matter anymore. But now Arthur is gone, and the truth I carried for 47 years is still sitting here with me, in this empty house. And the worst part is, it wasn't just my secret, it was his life too. When I first met Arthur, I was 45 years old and already convinced that my life had mostly happened without me. I had been married once before. Briefly. Puri. The kind of marriage that begins with hope and ends with quiet disappointment. We had no children, and when it ended, I packed my things into 2 suitcases and moved back to the small town where I'd grown up. For a while, I worked at the public library. It wasn't glamorous work, but I liked the smell of old books and the quiet rhythm of the place. People came and went. Whispers floated between shelves, and most days felt predictable. Arthur first walked through those doors on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I remember it clearly because he was dripping water all over the wooden floor and apologizing to everyone he passed. He had this way of smiling that felt slightly embarrassed, like he never quite believed he belonged wherever he was standing. He was tall, broad shoulders, gray just beginning to creep into his dark hair. "Sorry," he said to me at the desk, shaking rain from his coat. "I think I brought the storm inside." I laughed. I hadn't laughed like that in a long time. He was looking for a book about gardening. Tomatoes specifically. He had just bought a small house outside town and said he planned to grow the best tomatoes in the county. I remember teasing him. Everyone who checks out that book thinks they're going to grow the best tomatoes in the county. "Well," he said, leaning slightly on the desk, "I'm very competitive with vegetables." That was the first time I noticed the kindness in his eyes. Arthur started coming back every week after that. Sometimes for books. Sometimes just to return the ones he already had. After a few visits, he began lingering at the front desk. We talked about small things at first. The weather, books, the stray cat that lived behind the library dumpster. Then slowly we started talking about our lives. Arthur had been married too. His wife had died several years earlier after a long illness. He didn't talk about it in dramatic terms. Just quiet sentences like someone describing a storm that had already passed but left the ground soaked. "I thought I'd be alone after that," he told me one afternoon. I remember how gently he said it. "And now?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. Now I'm growing tomatoes. There was something about him that made silence feel comfortable. We could sit across from each other on the library steps during my lunch break and say almost nothing for 15 minutes. And somehow that felt like a full conversation. A few months later, he asked if I would like to see the garden he was building. I almost said no. At 45, you start believing certain doors are closed. Romance feels like something meant for younger people with lighter hearts. But Arthur had this patient way of asking questions, like he wasn't trying to convince you, just giving you the chance to say yes. So one Saturday afternoon, I drove out to his little house at the edge of town. The place was modest. White siding, a creaky wooden porch, a wide backyard that looked like it had been waiting years for someone to care about it. Arthur was standing in the garden when I arrived, holding a shovel like it was some kind of victory flag. "You're just in time," he said. "I planted the first row this morning." He walked me through the backyard like it was a grand estate. "These will be tomatoes," he said, pointing proudly. "And over here, peppers. Maybe cucumbers if I get ambitious." I remember watching him talk about that garden. The way his hands moved, the way his eyes lit up when he described the future. It struck me then how rare it is to meet someone who still believes the future holds something worth planting. We started seeing each other regularly after that. Nothing dramatic. Just dinners, long walks, quiet evenings on his porch. Sometimes we'd sit in lawn chairs and watch the sun disappear behind the trees while the smell of soil drifted through the air. Arthur had a calmness about him that made the world feel less rushed. When he laughed, it came from deep in his chest. When he listened, he really listened. After a year, he asked me to marry him. There was no grand proposal. No ring hidden in a glass of champagne. We were sitting in the garden one evening, dirt on our hands from pulling weeds. He looked over at me and said almost casually, "You know, this place would feel a lot more like a home if you lived here too." I stared at him for a moment. "Arthur, are you proposing?" He chuckled. "I suppose I am." I said yes. We were married 6 months later in a small church downtown. Only a handful of friends attended. No orchestra, no elaborate decorations. Just two people who had found each other later in life and decided not to waste the time they had left. The early years of our marriage were peaceful in a way that's hard to describe. Arthur worked part-time repairing farm equipment. I kept my job at the library. Every summer we harvested more tomatoes than two people could possibly eat. Our kitchen smelled like basil and garlic half the year. Arthur would proudly carry baskets of tomatoes to neighbors' doors like he was delivering treasure. "Best tomatoes in the county," he'd say. And honestly, they probably were. Looking back now, those years felt steady. Like floating on calm water. But there was something else too. Something small at first. A quiet weight I carried that Arthur never noticed. You see, when we met, there was already a part of my life I had sealed away. A chapter 1 had closed so tightly that even I tried not to think about it anymore. At first, it seemed harmless to keep it buried. Arthur never asked about certain years of my life, and I never volunteered the details. Most couples have a few old stories they don't tell. But sometimes the past isn't just a story. Sometimes it's a person. And sometimes that person is still out there somewhere, living a life shaped by a truth you never had the courage to speak aloud. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I told myself it belonged to a different version of me, a younger woman who had made choices she couldn't undo. Arthur loved me. I loved him. That should have been enough. But every once in a while, when Arthur talked about the kind of father he thought he might have been if life had gone differently, something inside my chest would tighten, and I would feel the secret pressing harder against my heart. Because Arthur believed we had never had children. But the truth was, we had. He just didn't know it. The first time Arthur told me he had always wondered what kind of father he might have been, we were standing in the kitchen on a Sunday morning. He was slicing tomatoes for breakfast, the sunlight coming through the window and landing across the cutting board. He said it so casually that anyone else might have missed the weight of it. "You know," he said, wiping the knife on a towel, "sometimes I think about what it would have been like to have a kid running around this place." He smiled when he said it, but it wasn't a sad smile. More like a quiet curiosity. I kept stirring the eggs in the pan and tried to sound light. "You would have spoiled them rotten." Arthur chuckled. "Probably." Then he added something that made my chest tighten. "But I think I would have liked teaching them things, how to fix things, how to grow tomatoes, that sort of stuff." I remember nodding, pretending to focus on the stove. But inside me something had started to move again. That old truth. The one I had buried years before Arthur ever walked into the library. Because long before I met him, when I was 23, Arthur and I had already crossed paths once. He didn't remember it, or maybe he never realized what it meant. But I did. I remembered every detail. It was the summer of 1957. I was young and restless and working at a diner 2 towns over. I had left home for the first time and thought I knew everything about the world. Arthur came in one evening with 2 other men. They were traveling through, working construction on a highway project. He sat at the counter, dusty and sunburned, and ordered a coffee and a hamburger. I noticed him immediately. Back then, Arthur had thick black hair and the kind of confident posture that comes with youth. He laughed loudly with his friends and talked with his hands. But when he spoke to me, he softened. "Long shift?" he asked while I refilled his coffee. "Feels like it," I said. We talked for maybe 10 minutes that night. 10 minutes. It didn't seem like much at the time. But he came back the next evening. And the one after that. The construction crew stayed in town for almost 2 weeks. And every night Arthur would sit at the counter after his shift ended. We talked about everything young people talk about when they think the future is endless. Music, travel, dreams. He told me he planned to move around the country for a few years, working different jobs before settling down somewhere. I told him I wanted to see the ocean one day. One night after the diner closed, he waited outside for me. The air smelled like asphalt and summer grass. "Want to go for a drive?" he asked. I should have said no. Even at 23, I knew better. But something about the way he asked made the world feel wide open. So I said yes. We drove out past the town lights until the road was empty and quiet. We parked near a field where crickets were singing in the dark. We talked for hours, and before the night ended, we kissed. It wasn't some grand romance. It was two young people caught in a moment. Arthur left town 3 days later. We promised to write each other letters. At the time, it felt like the beginning of something. But letters faded. Life moved forward. And within a few months, I realized something that changed everything. I was pregnant. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed staring at the small piece of paper the doctor handed me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read it. Back then, being unmarried and pregnant was not something people spoke about kindly. My parents would have been ashamed. The town would have whispered. And Arthur, well, Arthur was somewhere out there on a highway project hundreds of miles away. I had no address for him anymore. The construction company had moved on. For weeks I considered writing letters to every company office I could find, hoping one might reach him. But fear has a strange way of convincing you that silence is safer. I told myself he was probably building a life somewhere else. I told myself showing up with news like that would only ruin his future. So I made the decision alone. A decision that would follow me for the rest of my life. I left town quietly and moved to a small city where no one knew me. I found work in a sewing shop and rented a tiny apartment. 9 months later, I gave birth to a baby boy. I named him Daniel. I remember holding him for the first time, feeling a kind of love that frightened me with its intensity. But I was young, alone, working long hours just to survive. After 3 months, the weight of it all became more than I could carry. One afternoon, I sat in a small office with a couple who had been trying to have children for years. They were kind people, hopeful. They promised Daniel would have a stable home, a backyard, a good education. Things I couldn't give him at the time. Signing those papers felt like cutting something out of my own heart. But I told myself it was the right choice. For him. For everyone. I never told Arthur. In truth, I never expected to see him again. Life moved on. Years passed, and somehow decades later, fate placed him right in front of me again inside that quiet little library. When I realized who he was that rainy Tuesday afternoon, my hands actually trembled under the desk. But Arthur didn't recognize me. Time had changed us both, and part of me believed maybe that was a gift. A chance to start fresh, without the weight of the past. So I said nothing. When he asked me to marry him, I still said nothing. Every year that passed made the truth harder to speak, because by then, it wasn't just my secret anymore. It was the story of a son somewhere out there in the world. A son who had Arthur's smile. A son who had grown up never knowing who his real father was. And a husband sitting across from me every evening, talking about the children he thought he never had. The strange thing about secrets is that they don't grow lighter with time. People like to say that. They like to believe the past softens as the years pass. But the truth is, some things grow heavier. Especially when the person you're hiding them from is sitting across the dinner table every night, smiling at you with complete trust. Arthur and I built a life that most people would have called peaceful. And in many ways it truly was. We took road trips every autumn to see the leaves change. Arthur always insisted on driving the long scenic routes, even when it added hours to the trip. We watched old movies on Friday nights. He whistled while he worked in the garden. The tomatoes kept growing. Years rolled forward in quiet, ordinary ways. But every now and then, life would give me a moment that felt like someone gently tapping on the door of the truth I had locked away. One evening, about 15 years into our marriage, Arthur came home carrying a small cardboard box. Inside it was a wooden toy truck he had found at a flea market. He set it on the kitchen table like it was something precious. "Look at this," he said. I picked it up. The paint was chipped and the wheels squeaked when they turned. "Who's it for?" I asked. Arthur shrugged. "No one, I guess." He turned the truck slowly with his finger. "I just thought, if we'd had a little boy, he might have liked something like that." He laughed after saying it, like he was brushing the thought away. But that night, after Arthur went to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table staring at that toy truck for nearly an hour. Because somewhere in the world, there was a little boy who would have loved it. Our boy. Daniel would have been about 30 then. 30. I tried over the years to find small pieces of him. Not enough to disrupt his life. Just enough to know he was okay. Once, when Daniel was 22, I learned through a quiet search that the family who adopted him had moved to Oregon. Another time I discovered he had graduated from college. I even saw a photograph once in a newspaper clipping from a local marathon. He had Arthur's shoulders, Arthur's smile. I kept that clipping hidden inside an old cookbook in the back of the kitchen cabinet. Arthur never saw it. There were so many nights when I thought about telling him. Sometimes the words even reached my lips. Once, during a stormy evening when the power had gone out, we sat together in the living room with only candlelight flickering on the walls. Arthur said something that nearly broke me. "You know," he said quietly, "I don't regret many things in life, but I do wish I'd had a chance to be someone's father." My throat closed so tightly I couldn't speak. The truth was right there. All I had to do was open my mouth. But fear is powerful even when you're older. By that point, we had been married 25 years. Our lives were so settled, so peaceful. I was terrified that telling him would shatter something beautiful. What if he felt betrayed? What if he was angry that I kept it from him all those years? What if he started wondering about the son he had never known and it filled the rest of his life with regret? So once again, I stayed quiet, and life kept moving. Arthur retired. The garden grew larger. Our hair turned white. The years folded gently into each other. Until last spring. Arthur had been feeling tired for months, but he kept insisting it was nothing. "Just getting old," he said. But one afternoon he collapsed while watering the tomatoes. At the hospital, the doctor spoke in careful, quiet sentences. Heart failure. Arthur lived another 3 weeks after that. 3 weeks where I sat beside his hospital bed listening to the soft beeping of machines. And every single day, I told myself I would finally tell him. But each time I looked at his face, pale and fragile against the pillow, the courage slipped away. One evening, a few days before he died, Arthur reached for my hand. His voice was weaker than I had ever heard it. "You gave me a good life," he said. I tried to smile, but tears had already started running down my face. "No," I said. "You gave me one." He squeezed my fingers. "Funny thing," he whispered. "What?" I asked. Arthur looked at the window for a moment. "I still sometimes wonder what our kid would have looked like." That was the moment. The exact moment I had imagined 1,000 times. The truth rose up inside me like a wave. "Brother, you do have a son. His name is Daniel. He's out there living a life with your eyes and your laugh. You were a father all along." But I didn't say it. Instead, I just held his hand. Arthur passed away 2 days later, and the truth went with him. I'm 92 now. Daniel is 69. Last year I finally wrote him a letter. I told him everything. Who I was, who his father was, why I had stayed silent all those years. He wrote back 3 weeks later. The letter was simple. He said he had lived a good life. He said the parents who raised him loved him deeply. And then he wrote something that made me cry harder than I had in years. He said he wished he could have met Arthur, because from the way I described him, he sounded like the kind of man anyone would have been proud to call dad. So now I sit here in this quiet house. Arthur's garden is still outside the window. The tomatoes are starting to grow again this year. And sometimes I wonder how different things might have been if I had just told the truth sooner. But life doesn't give us many chances to rewrite our stories. So if there's anything I've learned after 92 years, it's this. The truth you're afraid will break someone's heart is often the truth that could have filled it.